Hello and welcome back to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I like to shoot in this room this time of day because of the weird lighting, but it actually kind of mimics the cover of the book I'm going to be talking about today, Scratching the Beat Surface by Michael McClure. And I've said for years that if I ever get to actually teach a creative writing class, um, I wouldn't use the traditional books that everybody uses because I hate all of them. I've never found a good one that I really do genuinely like. I would probably do something like Scratching the Beat Surface or Theater and Its Double by Antonin Artaud, something like that. I think it's much more helpful. Scratching the Beat Surface and Theater and Its Double. I did a video about Theater and Its Double a while ago. They both get down to really the core of what's going on. In McClure's talking about poems and Artaud's talking about theater, but they really get down to the core. A lot of those textbooks have that sort of taxonomic system that really drives me crazy, where it just sort of lists all the different categories and different things that you can do, and it gives exercises, and it never really breaks it down to the core. It gives an explanation of why any sort of art form actually works, but McClure attempts to do that. And I fully confess, I fully admit that my version of McClure might not be the actual version of McClure in Scratching the Beat Surface. Because just rereading it just recently, I'm not sure how practical it would be for a creative writing textbook. Because it's about a lot of different things. It's about his own poetry, about his coming to understand how poetry works in conversation with Charles Olson. And a lot of my explanation of Charles Olson and Michael McClure's ideas may not be the actual version of what they say. I usually, when I explain Charles Olson and Michael McClure, I say that might not be what they're actually saying. This might just be my version of it. Well, usually I break it down just the simplest way. I break it down to the idea that the process of poetry, the act of poetry, is an exchange of energy between poet and listener. And I'm sort of throwing in some Frank O'Hara there. I probably talked about Personism and Manifesto. The idea in Personism and Manifesto by Frank O'Hara, that would be another one. I would definitely teach that one. And it's also about poetry. The idea there, and it's also my version of Frank O'Hara, really. Probably not what he's actually saying. But the idea there is that you're not speaking to all of history and all of humanity and all of the universe. And Frank O'Hara says, this happens every time. Now it happens every time. Bo knocks off the rainbow circle. I need a better prop for the rainbow circle. My friend, the rainbow circle of the title. Um, I was talking about this with my friend Celia, a wonderful musician named Celia Gary, who's a local. But she likes my collages, and there's a collage in the video. So anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, Frank O'Hara. So Frank O'Hara says you're not writing for all of the universe. You're writing for just one person. You're not writing for all of time. You're writing for just one time. And it's just an exchange between two people. And it's an underratedly revolutionary sort of a concept. Because arguably the misconception that is one of the most egregious bits of inefficiency in our taken for granted concepts of how any sort of art form works is that any art form is speaking to all of humanity. So the human condition is that sort of concept that you hear thrown around a lot, as if to say, in a particular story, like a Kerouac story. I was talking about Kerouac a few times ago. If I say a few videos ago, if I say I like On the Road because Sal Paradise or Dean Moriarty, they stand in for all friendships. There's something human about Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty's friendship or whatever. There's something just intrinsically human about Sal Paradise seeking adventure, seeking excitement elsewhere, and his journey is the human journey. That's a really common sort of taken for granted reading of that kind of thing. Um, but Frank O'Hara would say, it's really just me reading about Cell Paradise. I like Cell Paradise because I find something interesting and appealing about him. It excites my imagination, and the story excites my imagination. I have this empathetic emotional experience with him. That's all it really needs to be. That's a much more efficient system. Because if you think about just Cell Paradise being intrinsically human, that whole reading of it, it goes from Kerouac, goes through all of humanity and all of history, and then hits me as a reader. And that's entirely unnecessary. And so if you tie that in with what McClure and Charles Olson were saying, Charles Olson in Projective Verse, Michael McClure, they all wrote a bunch of different books, but Michael McClure really boils a lot of it down here in Scratching the Beat Surface. But the whole idea is that poetry is exchanging energy between, or my interpretation of it. Over the years, it's boiled down to just my version of it. But it's an exchange of energy between poet and listener, or fiction writer and listener. And that's all it really needs to be. And McClure extends that further. This is where I was talking to Celia about this, but McClure extends that further and ties it to the body. That's a really common thing in beat poets, where, and that traces back to William Carlos Williams. That traces back to definitely to Walt Whitman. That was a big thing with Walt Whitman, where this ultra egalitarianism, where everything is holy, and Ginsberg says that, of course. Everything is holy, down to the body, which was considered traditionally profane. And William Carlos Williams talks a lot about how the lines in poetry match the breath. That's really the determiner of poetic lines, is the breath. So you look at the breath line lineation, for example, and William Carlos Williams, how that influenced Ginsberg. There's all kinds of his poetic history there. But McClure, definitely ties that into the body and says biologically, poetry is intrinsically tied with breath and your heart and all of these different biological systems. McClure, very much an environmentalist. And that's a huge part of his value system is environmentalism. He ties that up with all of the environment, with the energy flow between human body and nature. And then he ties it further with spirituality. So it's that sort of ultra egalitarianism that you see in Whitman, where all things are tied together, all things are sacred. That energy exchange goes from the highest levels of spirituality down to the earth itself. So that's the sort of idea of that energy exchange, where any sort of artistic act, if you narrow it down to the energy exchange of one person to another, it's a much more effective, much more efficient sort of concept of just the value in any piece. All you really have to do is elicit an empathetic experience in one person. That's all you're really aiming for. If you try to elicit an empathetic experience in all of humanity throughout all of history, what's it going to do but water it down? And even in a small scale, if you're talking about like a creative writing workshop, in that small scale, if you're trying to please everyone in the workshop, then you're going to water it down. If you're not trying to please everyone in the workshop, what's the point of the workshop? It's the logical catch-22 that is self-destructive of that Iowa workshop concept. But anyway, back to the positivity. I'm trying to be positive. So if you look at a lot of what he says, and he talks about a lot of other things other than that whole energy idea. To create poetry, one must have a system, or an anti-system, or a systemless system. A systemless system is one that alters itself in the waves with a living anarchism, like the evolution through scores of millions of years of the Portuguese man of war and other colonial. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pronounce that. Or the migration systems worked out by the bison or the wildebeest. Each individual's actions and patterns are a recapitulation of the old deep patterns in the meat. He uses the word meat a lot. I like it. Deep in the meat, the muscles, the breath, the heart, the lungs. Deep in the body of the poet. And deep in the evolution of the poet and the system and any sort of system. And that's sort of the idea of the system is that there's this old tradition of like poetic system or any sort of fictional system. And he's saying the system is an organic system. It's as any sort of system of poetry is an organic system, as old as bison migrating. That's a system, but it's deep in our biology, deep in our ecology, deep in our ecosystem. But this is I think probably the most useful section is the shape of energy. There's lots and lots of stuff about his own biography and his own history. And then there's a lot of stuff about the Sixth Gallery. He has a whole description of the Sixth Gallery, which was an amazing historical moment for the Beats. The first reading of Howl, he was there, so he describes that. And he talks about Shelley, and Shelley is a complicated guy. And Shelley shares a lot of those similar sort of ideas, presumably. The Demogorgon, I think, was the thing from Shelley that I find most appealing. The whole idea of the demiurge, the primordial energy that's still present in all of us and is forbidden based on a lot of the more conformist systems of society today. The oppressed demiurge that comes out in poetry. And you see a lot of similar things in Whitman. I don't agree with everything Shelley says, but Shelley's kind of a complicated character to agree with. But yeah, that whole idea of the demiurge, so the demigorgon, that primordial energy that's intrinsic to any sort of artistic act. And he's McClure's quoting Mont Blanc. In that energy structure, Shelley allows his intellect at its highest capacity, stimulated by conversations with Mary, Byron, and their entourage, to become a system through which energy passes to organize the system in the process of almost onomatopoetically repeating the wild mountain scene in the music of the poem. Shelley creates a new poem shape. In it he may, in fact, be the voice of the universe that has broken through his person to sing itself in a previously unexpressed way. These lines seem to be the energy of the universe expressing itself upon the complex organism of Shelley's body, as if he were a typewriter of protein spirit. McClure has some great word choices. It is the river below and the glacier above in their immediate energy form, and the clouds passing over, and the movement of storms over the peaks, and the burst of pines from the dark subsoil into the vivid air, that are the most present charges. It seems that way, for that is what Shelley paints with his sensorium and sense of music. But there is also an older, deeper energy source present. Beneath the mammal-human biography of Shelley's life, there is a very ancient consciousness expressing itself in his imagination, as his imagination is liberated by the inspiration of his surroundings. Many billions of years before the present, all the physical matter in the universe exploded from a single superdense ball. The turbulence of the exploded matter drifting through the space that it seems to have created was not evenly spread, and densifications of matter took place in a certain area of space. The densifications became complex and compact, and they in turn exploded. He's talking about the demiurge. The surface of the Earth complicated itself into very new molecules. These then crumpled themselves for their own preservation and the extension of energy. They created I'm not going to try to pronounce that one. Dancing film that a biologist friend calls rainbow mud, of which we are a part, of which Shelley was a part. The material of Shelley was in the original primeval explosion and went through all of the densifications and expansions and complications. But anyway. So yeah, it's he talks about the demiurge, the demigorgon. That's the center of the rainbow circle. If I can see the rainbow circle. Center of the rainbow circle. That's kind of how I imagine the center of the rainbow circle as that primordial energy. And the way the rainbow circle really works is it's a spectrum of that primordial energy and levels of destimulation, levels of containment of that energy. So, the parataxis, the paradox-parataxis section, is just a small step away from that churning demiurgical energy. And then you have the schematic, which is one of the most useful ones to use for storytelling. Gives it a shape that's really intrinsic to that story. So a poem has a shape and has a system. And I think that's, from my interpretation at least, that's what he's talking about with the system. A system that's really just intrinsic to the story itself. And McClure, of course, connects that whole idea of an intrinsic system to the story itself. He connects it to all of the really natural systems. And then you get to, the much more conformist, limiting sort of end of the spectrum, the higher up you go. But the pure demiurgical force, I would say, is that the green spot there at the center. The green spot at the center there. Let's see. And then, so later in that chapter, he says, first it is necessary to point out that complex systems are more stable through time than simpler systems. I think this is the part I wanted to read. A system that has within it loops of energy and feedback and processing and reprocessing resembles a bridge with many support systems balancing out gravity's pull. It is like a building with internal walls and pillars and exterior flying buttresses. Evolved in form, complexity, and diversity within the system allows the possibility of its extension through time. For instance, in government we have bureaucracies. They are clearly foolish wastes, but in the long run they are stabilizers of the governing system. They slow down, complicate, and solidify it. Vertebrates have complicated glandular, venous, and nervous systems that are not necessarily necessary to higher invertebrates. But the individual vertebrate is a more stable system than a mollusk, and will probably live and produce longer. Right before that, he talks about it, the systems, like the schematic, that third level. And then just moving up and up, you have more and more complex systems, but designed to contain the energy and destimulate the energy. It is not easy to see energy in use. This is the part I was going to look. Oh, even before that. In looking at energy in organisms and art, it is valuable to study the relationships of energy to information and to memory and to diversity, to organization and to complexity. It is not easy to see energy in use, to see energy in action in the bundles and bodies that contain it. It is in such frontier work that we are the closest to the description of the systemless system that is in fact defined by the presence and nature of life. So the way to think about it, I mean, this is what I would recommend just in considering shaping a story. So going from an impulse, there's so many good things in this book to look at. And shaping a story, going from that demiurgical impulse, you can consider organizational schemes organic. So something really basic like repetition. Repetition could be organic. So you can have, that sort of systemless system of that you see in nature of things repeating but being slightly different. So theme and variation. This is one reason why an organizing system in an artwork like theme and variation is so appealing, because you have an organic sort of repetition but it has enough of a change where it still is capable of stimulating. And that's arguably because that is the sign of life. That is the sign of something being alive and living, something having an organic, living presence behind it. Whereas if you just repeat the exact same thing just over and over again, that's what I would call mechanical repetition, and that's something you can use really practically. As I said, not a whole lot you can really practically use, but if you look at the concept, the practical way to understand it is to look at why mechanical repetition, just repeating the exact same thing over and over again, that gets more and more to the destimulating end of the spectrum. So the more and more you hear the exact same thing, the more it loses energy. Or the more you see something, the more it loses energy. You cease to even think about it. You cease to even recognize it. It doesn't stimulate at all. But anyway, so that's a magnificent book. I stumbled across this one, and I misplaced my books all the time, and I found it. But I also found the opposite end of the spectrum, The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. The prime example of everything wrong with these books. I don't want to be too negative. This is another great book. This one has so many amazing things. I might cover this one later. Conversations with Eugenie Ionesco by Claude Bonnefoy. One of my favorite books of all time. I found this in a little thrift shop in Sylva, North Carolina. I'll never forget the pure joy of finding this. This is garbage. But this is amazing. This is actually a first edition. I don't remember exactly where I got it, but this is it was only $15, but it's a first edition. The Conversations with the UNESCO was $1. This was $15. That's the first edition. I think I might have gotten this in a bookshop called McClure's in Clemson. It was an amazing bookshop. It's not there anymore, but it's an amazing bookshop that used to be there. It was called McClure's, and I got a couple of Michael McClure books in there. I don't know if they were related or not. The owners were named McClure. I don't know if they were related or not. But this is an amazing book. If you can get a copy, it's got so many good things in it. Even if you're not writing, it's still, it's a great meditative book on all kinds of crazy stuff. If you just want to know the history of the beats, it has a lot of that in there too. But anyway, I hope you got something out of that. I don't know. Have a good day. See you on the next episode.